Precursor oxide masses are determined based on the stoichiometric formula for desired composition. Using proper PPE, the precursor oxides are weighed onto a scale with parchment paper under the powder. Powder is moved from original container to parchment paper using a spatula. Once desired mass of a precursor oxide has been achieved, it is moved to a larger parchment paper with all precursor oxides will go to make the desired composition. When weighing out a new precursor oxide, the spatula must be cleaned with a chem wipe and isopropyl alcohol to ensure that there is no cross-contamination with the precursor oxides. This process is repeated until all desired precursor oxides are weighed out and placed onto the larger parchment paper. Once this is done, the larger parchment paper with all desired precursor oxides is carefully poured into a glass vial where it stores the weighed precursor oxides until it is time to mill the powders. To prepare speed mixing of ceramic powder, utilize a 15 milliliter zirconia jar with 10 5 millimeter zirconia balls. Pour the ceramic powder from the glass vial into the zirconia jar, ensuring that all powder has been emptied. Next, using a plastic 1 milliliter syringe, add 2 milliliters of isopropyl alcohol to the jar. Once added to the jar, close the jar by pressing the half of the jar onto the other half with the protruding zirconia lip. They should be pressed straight down and not at an angle. Once the jar has been closed, inspect the circumference to ensure that the closure is flush. For preparation of specs milling of ceramic powder, utilize a 45 milliliter zirconia jar with two 12 millimeter zirconia balls. As before, pour your ceramic powder into the zirconia jar and add 2 milliliters of isopropyl alcohol. When closing this jar, ensure that the gasket is sitting flush on top of the jar half, and then set the zirconia lid on top of the gasket and jar. When taping the speed mixer jar, use electrical tape to wrap around the circumference of the jar 3 times. While wrapping, hold down on the top and bottom half of the jar to ensure that the jar is fully sealed when the tape is being added. Once the third layer has been added, cut off the electrical tape with a pair of scissors and place into the plastic brace. When taping the Spetsmill jar, start by wrapping circumference gap between the jar and the lid twice with electrical tape. Then, wrap twice along the vertical of the entire jar and lid. If you use a speed mixer, use the touchscreen to unlock the lid to insert your jar. Inserting the jar and apparatus, place into the metal basket and lock to secure in place. Once on the touchscreen, modify the RPM and time to your desired experimental needs. Note that for these 15 milliliter zirconia jars, you cannot exceed 2500 RPM and cannot exceed 50 minutes within a single mixing run. Once desired parameters have been established, close the lid and press the green start button on the touchscreen. When operating on the specs mill, use the arrows on the interface to adjust the milling time for your sample. Unlatch the specs mill under the handle to open the specs mill. Place your specs mill jar onto one of the jar holders in the mill. Ensure that the jar is sitting flushed with the grooves of the holder and begin to twist the metal knob to secure the jar. Once the jar is fully secured, tighten the washer that is above the metal knob until it can no longer be tightened. On the opposite jar holder, either another sample jar can be placed or an empty jar. Regardless of which option, there must be another jar in the opposite jar holder to act as a counterbalance for the specs mill. Repeat the previous steps of securing the jar in place for the second jar. Once completed, close the lid of the specs mill and relatch to ensure that the specs mill is closed and locked. Finally, press the start button on the interface of the mill. When the speed mixer has finished, remove the electric tape from the circumference of the jar. Once that is completed, carefully twist the jar and gently remove the top from the bottom half of the jar. Once the halves have been removed, pour the contents of the bottom half of the jar into a petri dish. Remove the zirconia balls from the petri dish with a pair of tweezers and move them in an isolated container. Then take the speed mixer jar halves and the petri dish containing the slurry mixture, place them in a vacuum oven at 85 degrees Celsius, where they will dry overnight. Once the containers have dried, scrape the powder with a wooden stencil. The scraped powder from the petri dish and the zirconia jar halves are then placed onto parchment paper and poured into a glass vial. When scraping powder off the specs mill jar, start by using the lid as a base for the two zirconia balls. Using the pair of tweezers to hold the balls in place, scrape the powder off of them. Once a ball's powder has been scraped, move it to the side and work on the other one. Afterwards, scrape the underside of the zirconia lid. Pour the loose powder onto parchment paper as needed. Finally, scrape the powder off the jar half. Ensure that you start with the protruding zirconia lip first and then work your way down inside the jar. Once completed, pour this powder onto the parchment paper. Take the scraped powder from the parchment paper and transfer it to an agate mortar and pestle. Grind the powder in a circular motion until the powder becomes finer than before. Once done, pour the grinded powder onto a new piece of parchment paper and use a smaller one to scrape off any powder that is stuck in the mortar. Clean the mortar and pestle after use with a Chem wipe and isopropanol alcohol. You press the ceramic powder into a pellet, the metal die is inserted into the black base. Next, using one of the small metal anvils, the flat faces are held while the sides are lightly lubricated with zinc stearate on a cotton swab. Once lubricated, the slab is placed into the metal die. Afterwards, the ceramic powder is then poured into the die. If the powder begins to overflow, the apparatus can be tapped to loosen the powder down into the die. In addition to this, the apparatus can be tapped on the sides to ensure that the powder is leveled on the surface. Following this, another small metal anvil is lubricated and placed on top of the powder inside the die. Finally, the metal plunger is lubricated on its sides and inserted into the die. The die apparatus is placed in the center of the press, with the metal plunger facing upwards to the roof of the press. Once centered, the safety window is closed and locked in place. To raise the platform, crank the lever up and down until the pressure is applied at 5,000 pounds force. Let it hold this pressure for 60 seconds. Afterwards, lower the platform with the dial slowly to release the pressure. Remove the apparatus from the press and then carefully remove the black base from the apparatus. Now place it back into the press with the metal plunger facing down on the platform. Add the metal ring barrier on top of the apparatus facing towards the roof of the press. Close and lock the safety window and crank the lever until a ding is heard, as this is when the pellet is pressed out of the die. When extracting the pellet from the die, remove the metal anvil from the top of the pellet and use a pair of tweezers to remove the pellet. Place this pellet onto an aluminum crucible that is layered with yttria stabilized zirconia beads. For a ceramic sample to be sintered, first have a thermal program written out onto a sticky note. To start, extend the aluminum slab inside the furnace outside to place your aluminum crucible. Place the crucible in the center of the slab and push the slab until it's flush with the edge of the aluminum tube. Then push the slab with a metal furnace rod until the tube is in line with the marker on the furnace rod. Then place the insulation cylinder inside the aluminum tube. Next, line up the gasket end cap with the opening of the aluminum tube. Ensure that the screw lines up with the creases in the end cap, and that the gasket and end cap are flush with the tube. Then tighten the screws onto the end cap. Once finished, the end cap should now be fixed and stationary. Following this, the cool water must be turned off for the furnace. This is achieved by twisting the two white valves next to the furnace to the on position. Programming the furnace starts with flipping the circuit breaker, then flipping the green master switch to the on position, and then pressing the over temp reset button. On the controller interface, press the paper icon until you reach the run section, then press the counterclockwise arrow once to get to the program section. Use the up and down arrows to select which program you wish to modify, and press the counterclockwise arrow to edit the segments of each program. For this program, it starts with a ramp rate to 800C at a rate of 200C per hour. The next segment is ramping to 1650C at a rate of 100C per hour. The third segment is a dwell, where the temperature is held at 1650 for 20 hours. The fourth segment marks the beginning of cooling down, going from 1650 to 800C at a rate of 100C per hour. For the fifth segment, 800C to room temperature at a rate of 200C per hour. The sixth segment is set to end the program, followed by resetting the furnace after the program has concluded. Once you back out of the program edit, hit the paper icon until you get to the run section. Hit the counterclockwise arrow until you reach the desired program, then press it again to get to the start section, followed by pressing the up arrow to set the program status to run. The run light will be visible above the arrow. Press the paper button to display the active furnace temperature. Display the hot sign above the furnace once the program has begun. Using a sponge and warm water, scrub off any residue powder from the speed mixer jar and zirconia balls. To prepare a cleaning cycle, ensure the jar is filled halfway with water, the 10 zirconia balls, small dose of alkanut soap, and 2 small glass shards. Repeat taping procedure for speed mixer jar and loading to the speed mixer. For the cleaning parameters, use 2500 RPM at 20 minutes. Once finished, wash out the soapy water residue and leave the jar and balls out to dry. If jar is not fully clean, repeat process until it becomes completely clean. For the Spetsmill jar, repeat the previous cleaning process, but with larger quantities of water, soap, and size of glass shards. For Spetsmill mixing parameters, set milling time to 40 minutes. Once finished, wash out soapy water and set jar and balls out to dry.